Hello, welcome to another edition of Champion Brief's video topic analysis. My name is Daniel Shatzkin. I'm the editor-in-chief of Champion Brief's LD Brief. Today I'll be discussing the 2019 NSDA Nationals topic, Resolve, Violent Revolution is a Just Response to Political Oppression. Now, this is a historical question of political philosophy, and it's one that draws from numerous examples in history. Before going into the specific argumentation, I want to first talk to you about a couple of words in the resolution, then a little bit about the history of violent revolution, and finally the arguments that we can use on this topic. Now, the first word I want to talk to you about is political oppression. What exactly is political oppression? Well, oppression is really just as defined as the exercise of authority or power in burdensome, cruel, or unjust manner, meaning that political oppression is just a form of power or authority used by the government, essentially, to oppress a certain people, or power used in a burdensome, cruel, or unjust manner by the federal government. What does that mean, really, though? It's pretty vague. We have a constitution in the United States that supposedly defines what that means, but we also have different laws and everything like that that help set up a society that is ruled by law, meaning that those rules are supposedly ones that should allow us ultimate freedom. Let's put it that way. But we all kind of have different views on whether or not those rules are good. For example, recently there was an issue with grazing rights, and we have rules and laws regarding grazing rights and the freedoms around grazing rights. And some people feel that those rules and laws are unjust and oppressive. That's a form of political oppression on farmers. Would they have the right to violently revolt? Economic oppression. Is that a form of political oppression? I don't know. Some people would say that the political system supports the economic system. Other people would say that there's a decision that has to be made, and if a majority of people in the country support a capitalist system of economy without social safety nets, then the oppression of that system is not really a political oppression because that was the choice of the society. There are other questions then that you'd have to delve into about whether or not that's actually all of society making those decisions, if those decisions are informed decisions. But still, when you talk about political oppression, you can start getting into really nitty-gritty areas about what really is oppression. Every year around Christmas time in the holiday season, you have people who argue that not saying Merry Christmas in a checkout is a form of political oppression. Is political oppression political correctness, or is it from the government? There are so many ways that you can play with the term political oppression to make all sorts of things applicable to the topic. It's really going to be up to the affirmative in the round to try and clarify the debate early. If not, the negative can go through a whole bunch of different things about why the topic, just in a general principle, may not be good, because political oppression is really a vague term and can be applied to so many different standards, and people have so many different opinions as to what actually is oppression and what isn't. I mean, obviously there are things that are really forms of oppression. You look at, in certain countries where you have women who don't have equal rights to men. Even in America, there are issues where women are suffering with equal rights. There's forms of racial oppression that are very clear and obviously can be addressed by this topic. There's forms of gendered oppression and, just all sorts of different identity politics issues that are very, very obvious on this topic that are forms of political oppression. But to what extent can also be turned around in saying that if violent revolution is good for one form of political oppression, is it good for all forms of political oppression? Or maybe some forms of political oppression are actually some things like suppression. And what's the difference really between repression, oppression, and suppression? So these are all going to be questions that you have to delve into on the topic that you really need to flesh out before you go further on. Because obviously, if you want to suppress things like, far-right Nazi activity, the people who are those Nazis may say that that's a form of political oppression. But is suppression and oppression the same thing? If you warrant it on one side, but you don't warrant it on the other, that kind of would violate certain philosophical principles that exist, that that when we start looking into the definitions of just responses, universalizing those responses. If it's good for, let's say conditions like slavery and political slavery, politically justified slavery, wouldn't it also be justified for the slavers if there is a political right for them under the topic? And that's where this topic is really problematic, because it justifies it only in forms of political oppression. It doesn't say morally wrong political oppression, just political oppression. And political oppression can really mean a lot of different things. So we'll go into that a little bit more when I talk about arguments on the negative and also on the affirmative. Let's talk, though, about revolution. I'm going to ignore the word violent for a second here, because violent can mean a lot of different things too, but I want to talk specifically about the act of a revolution. Revolution can be defined, in this case by Merriam-Webster's, as a sudden, radical, or complete change, or a fundamental change in political organization, especially the overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler and the substitution of another by the government. So what does this really mean? There are some authors out there who would argue things like just a change in the governor, or who governs the governed, doesn't really count as a revolution. What's really a revolution is when there's a massive radical shift in how the government changes. So let's go back in history and talk about a famous revolution in history. That's the American Revolution. There are a couple of authors out there that would argue that things like the American Revolution weren't actually that revolutionary. Yes, we got rid of the king in America. But what really happened politically? The British common law system was just transferred over and written into a new American legal code. Parliament, which was made up by rich white men, was replaced with a Congress made up of rich white men. A king was replaced with an executive, although the executive was now responsible to the people and not, a divine authority. There was still essentially the same government in place. You had a little bit more responsibility to the people, but let's remember, England after the Glorious Revolution in 1688 was functionally governed by Parliament. The king, a more political figure than the monarchy is today under Queen Elizabeth and even her predecessors, there was still, the crown was largely a figurehead still, and he had slightly more influence, but Parliament ruled the country, and Parliament ruled its colonies too, and set about all of the laws. So there really wasn't that much of a shift in how things were governed in the colonies and then into the new American country. So that may not actually have counted as a revolution. What is a revolution then, if that isn't a revolution? Revolutions that occurred in China, like the Communist Revolution, and revolutions like the Russian Revolution, which completely overthrew imperial monarchies and replaced them by new systems entirely, and new economic systems, and had completely shifted the relationship of the governed and the governors. That's a real revolution in that sense. So you can argue that the only things that are topical then under these definitions are revolutions that completely upend the political order that exists within countries and societies. So small revolutions and civil wars and stuff that basically recreate the same political conditions that existed prior to the revolutions, maybe with minor changes, wouldn't necessarily count as a full-scale revolution under those extreme definitions. Now, more minor definitions of revolutions that just talk about, changes in the political authority and who is the governed, or who is the governors, rather, even if they come from the same class, those definitions are probably more beneficial for the affirmative. The negative is going to really want to narrow the topic down to these revolutions that cause extreme shifts in the political system, because those are the ones that probably destabilize the most and will give you a lot of different advantages. Even if you want to give it in that narrow sense of just, changing who governs, over certain people and stuff like that, the negative can still have a lot of ground under those topics. But keeping it really narrow is going to be helpful in topicality debates. Finally, talking about the word violent within the resolution. So a lot of different ways that violence can be interpreted. Let's remember we have a legal code that talks about, violent crime is different forms of crime, like, theft can be a violent crime if you threaten bodily harm and things like that. But theft that no one is threatened, no one's injured, and there's no harm to somebody isn't considered necessarily a violent crime. So how do we define violence in these terms of revolutions can be really interesting. For example, let's say there's a communist revolution. Let's say that revolution, though, is bloodless. Is it still a violent revolution? Well, there are authors that talk about redistribution of wealth as a form of violence, right? It's a material form of violence. It's not going to be a form of violence where somebody is actually physically, stabbed or something, but when you take something from somebody, that's still a violent act, potentially. There are other definitions of violent revolutions that would include, forms of actions that could be imaginary violence, right? You can talk about different forms of imaginary acts of violence and what that does in a liberatory fashion. So you can really expand the resolution when you talk about violence. But I just want to be cautious here about what the resolution is asking us about. And it's really asking a violent revolution. So violence to upend the system is okay in forms of any type of political oppression, right? It's a just response to political oppression. It keeps it very vague. And remember, political oppression is itself a vague term, and two people who are on the different sides of an issue can both be claiming that they're oppressed. And there could be actual justifications for both sides, which I'll talk about here in a minute when I go into the history of the topic. So the topic really is asking us a very, very vague question. Now let's move on to the history of the topic here a little bit. Starting in the late 1700s, there was a move of political upheaval in the world that tended towards a liberalization of government. And what do I mean by a liberalization? In this case, I'm talking about governments that are more responsible towards the people and removing power from the divine right of kings. This occurs first in the Americas. You see, obviously, the American Revolution, which I previously discussed, overthrew the king. Well, it kept most of the British political system intact in the Americas. It replaced the king with an executive. France took this step a little bit further. The French Revolution first dissolved the monarchy entirely, and you have the First French Republic. Well, the First French Republic ultimately fails because Napoleon rises to power, and this is going to be a theme throughout revolutions, is that a lot of times the promise of the revolution is co-opted by others within society and their temptations for power. But there was a momentary success of overthrowing a monarchy and completely getting rid of, monarchy-type power in France. Ultimately, that failed and led to Napoleon and the, decades of French civil unrest, and you have the Revolution of 1830 that happens and starts in France. You have revolutions in the late 1850s that happen again in France, and you have kind of a recurring theme that France is a center of liberal revolution against monarchy. They don't often succeed for very long, but each time they try and gain more rights for the common people in France. In England, you see political revolutions after the Glorious Revolution in 1688 kind of tail off there. Yes, you have colonial revolutions against, British monarchical power, but what you don't see is internal unrest in England. And that's mainly because the parliamentary system in England constantly reformed itself and prevented the type of unrest that happened throughout Europe. In Belgium, you see unrest against, when they were in Belgian Netherlands at the time, they didn't like being controlled by the Dutch. And they wanted the freedoms that they had when they were, a territory of the Habsburg Empire. They were basically let to govern themselves and be free. And they saw, certain liberties occurring throughout the rest of Europe. And, the Belgian Revolution against the Dutch was essentially not necessarily bloodless, but it led to Belgian independence against the monarchy. So these early revolutions that you saw were essentially anti-monarchical revolutions. And they were generally supported by the business class, so business owners and stuff like that. Later revolutions were more nationalistic. That's like the Belgian Revolution that I talked about before. You also have revolutions that occurred in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's where you get the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was the Austrian Empire under the Habsburgs. Then the Hungarians wanted to increase their own independence and national identity. And so they, fought civil wars essentially against the Austrians and got some separation. And then you have other, Slavic peoples in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who want their own freedoms and independence, and slowly but surely that's how you get to World War I, essentially, is all of these different peoples seeking out their national identities, right? So when we have these revolutions, nationalism is national identity is a form of a political oppression. They suppress people's identities. In modern days, you see that with people like the Basque people or the Kurdish people, who are both seeking, independence in their own states, right? Just like people in history sought their own independence, like the Slavic peoples in, the Czech Republic and Slovenia, and all these independent states now that were once part of greater empires that essentially had their own national identity that they expressed and, fought for their own national rights. And post-World War I, you see, the expression of these states popping up more often. Even Kosovo, right, more recently in the 90s is another example of this, where you have an independent, ideal people, and you have a war that's fought over all of these things. So when we're talking about the topic in a historical sense, there is a lot of times where violence is taken up by people to overthrow governments and express their national, self and stuff like that. So nationalism becomes an idea of political expression and a form of something that may need to be politically suppressed in different states to prevent violence. So when we talk about violence response to political oppression, you're now justifying acts potentially of terrorism and stuff like that have occurred in response to those political oppressions. Think of the Irish and the British and that struggle and the struggles that occurred between those peoples for generations, right? The political oppression and the murder on both sides that occurred by extremists can be justified as forms of political oppression and resisting political oppression, right? So it becomes very sketchy. Let's look at even our own American history past, right? When we talk about the Civil War. The Civil War is a form of, there's always, it's states' rights. Well, what was the state right? They were trying to advocate their right for slavery that was expressed in our Constitution. That's why the American Constitution is so problematic, is that it defended slavery, right? In the Civil War, if you look at it on the side of the South, they had a constitutional argument for it. If you look at the side of the North, obviously morality was correct. The Constitution was clearly immoral by justifying and, arguing for slavery. But when you talk about political oppression, the South was being politically oppressed. The right that they wanted was a horribly immoral right and should never have been advocated for by anything, but it was there in the Constitution, and that's what the South wanted. So you can twist the topic in the resolution to justify a lot of really immoral and crazy things, potentially, because it's a form of political oppression. Oppression's in the eye of the beholder. So what does that mean for how you should argue at NSDA Nationals? I think the best way to go about it in NSDA Nationals is to argue the topic from a conceptual philosophical level. On the affirmative, you have authors like Locke, who would argue that violent revolution is justified in the case of political oppression when you're on the moral high ground, right? It wouldn't justify, acts like the Southern secession and slavery and things like that, because doesn't have the moral high ground. But when the government loses that moral holding of the people, then it's the people's right to revolt against the government, according to Locke. There are also arguments that talk about how freedom, and the only point that freedom can come from, is a violent act. I believe that's Derrida who talks about that. It's the originary act. It's violence has to come at the start of freedom, and liberty comes from violence. There are authors that talk about how if we want to overthrow the capitalist system, we have to use violent oppression. That's why the Bolshevik revolution ultimately became a violent revolution. They killed the czars, the czar and the entire czarist family and all the entire imperial family in order to wipe out any chance of going back to the old ways and stuff like that. That's an incredibly violent act. Mao's revolution in China, fighting against Chinese nationalists who were much more capitalistic, that was a violent act, and he had to wipe out, the people who were not going to, were dissidents and stuff like that. There are a lot of authors that talk about how any type of full-on communist revolution has to come with an act of violence, that it won't happen in a peaceful way, because if it's peaceful, it'll be co-opted by neoliberalism and all these things that make it feel like we're doing the good thing against capitalism, but we're really just supporting the system in new ways. On the negative, first and foremost, the resolution justifies so much. Under a Kantian perspective, you're universalizing the act of violence against all forms of political oppression. So the resolution then justifies, the acts of the South against the North, in the U.S. Civil War, even though they were on definitely the moral low ground there. According to Kant, it justifies all sorts of acts that would be, appalling. It just says violent revolution. Well, what happens in violent revolutions? People die. Innocent people die a lot of times. So you're justifying, the death of innocent people who may not be connected to the political conditions solely because of, political oppression that exists on your class of people. And so the resolution justifies a lot more violence than it seems to on face. There's also questions like, can you actually overthrow the sovereign? Is that just? If Locke says that when the sovereign loses the respect of the people, they can be overthrown, kind of the opposite of that would be Hobbes, who argues that the power of the sovereign is immutable and you can't overthrow the sovereign. So all of that has to come into play. More complicated arguments on both sides obviously exist, but I think on the basic level, those clear classical political philosophy positions are winners. I mentioned rage positions earlier. Those are really interesting arguments on identity politics if you want to go that route at nationals. I don't know if it's very strategic at nationals to use identity politics-based arguments in every round, but it's definitely something that can be utilized under this topic. And there are authors out there on every single different issue that talk about why violence is kind of needed to bring attention to forms of political oppression that exist. So, there's so many ways you can go about this topic. You can go, very traditional. You can go very progressive. My advice to you at NSDA Nationals is stick to the more traditional route. If you want to have that progressive case to pull out, you can. On the negative, if you want to go more progressive, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can go policy style and run counter plans, nonviolent revolutions solve best, things like that. You can go with a lot of different disadvantages, co-option DAs and stuff like that. Remember I talked about Napoleon? He's not the only one who's co-opted revolutions before. There are a lot of different leaders who have co-opted people's revolutions to rise as dictators. In essence, Stalin did that in Russia. There are a lot of different leaders who have come to be dictators after coming to power through revolutions that installed them as, representatives of the people, and, the people had no intent to make them a dictator. So, those types of arguments are very, very applicable on the topic. Really, you can go any way you want to on this topic, and you'll have a pretty good strategy. I hope you found this TA helpful, and good luck to you this summer at NSDA Nationals. I hope you find success in Dallas, and thank you very much for viewing.